Good evening, and welcome to the University of Maryland. I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities and professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Dean's Lecture Series presented by the College of Arts and Humanities and the College of Education. This is the Arts and Humanities 11th season of our Dean's Lecture Series. In this series, we invite speakers to engage in thought-provoking lectures and conversation about their ideas, bodies of work, and stories that speak to the role of the arts and humanities in addressing grand challenges and shaping our global future. This past fall, the College of Arts and Humanities redoubled our longtime commitment to teaching, learning, and studying issues of race, equity, and justice, and launched a campaign to ensure that these important issues are even better addressed in our curriculum, scholarship, programming, and community engagement. As part of this commitment, we aim to increase awareness and knowledge and enhance the impact of our work. We have also sought to collaborate with partners on campus who share those same values, interests, and commitments. Thus, we're thrilled to be in partnership with the College of Education tonight as we welcome our guest, the award-winning author and social justice activist, Monique Morris. Dr. Morris's research intersects race, gender, education, and justice to explore the ways in which Black communities and other communities of color are uniquely affected by social policies. You'll hear a longer introduction of her in a minute. In tonight's conversation, we will have the opportunity to hear more about the role of research and scholarship in the effort to counter the educational, judicial, and societal disparities facing Black girls in schools. One of our goals for this series is to promote community, broaden understanding, and generate conversations that give us new insights. We do so in a manner that models respect and empathy. Following Dr. Morris's presentation, you will be invited to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get through as many questions as we can. You are also invited to participate in the conversation on Twitter at hashtag ARHUDLS and hashtag EDTERPSDLS. That's hashtag RHUDLS and hashtag EdTurksDLS. Please note this event is being recorded and closed captioning is available by pressing the CC button also at the bottom of your screen. So at this time, please join me in welcoming our co-host for tonight's lecture, Dean of the College of Education and Professor of Education Policy, Jennifer King Rice, who will share remarks and introduce our speaker, Dean Rice.
Thank you so much, Dean Thornton Dill. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer King Rice, Dean of the College of Education and Professor of Education Policy, and it is my great honor to welcome you all to our 2021 College of Education Dean's Lecture on Education and Society, our first joint Dean's Lecture with the College of Arts and Humanities. And I say first because I hope there are many more. Our College of Education Dean's Lecture Series features prominent education scholars, leaders, and public intellectuals discussing some of the most pressing education and equity issues of the day. Previous speakers have included former U.S. Secretary of Education, John King Jr., and former USM Chancellor, Dr. Britt Kirwan, also chairman of the Maryland Commission on Innovation and Excellence in Education. The Dean's Lecture on Education and Society was started with the support of some very special alumni of both the College of Education as well as the College of Arts and Humanities, the Clairvit family. Allie Clairvit graduated with her undergraduate and master's degrees in special education from the College of Education, and Nancy Clairvit graduated with her undergraduate degree in design from the College of Arts and Humanities. The Clairvit family, including Nancy's husband Chuck and her son Sam, shared my vision for the Dean's Lecture on Education and Society and have supported it every year. So thank you for that support. At the College of Education, we are deeply committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in all that we do through education. We prepare the next generation of educators to support the success of diverse students. We evaluate pedagogical and assessment practices for implicit bias. And we recognize that anti-Black racism in academia needs to be addressed. This year, we formed Courage, our new Council on Racial Equity and Justice, to challenge ourselves as a college to look at how our own systems may create inequitable outcomes and how we can adjust our policies and practices to support the full participation and success of all students, and ultimately, how we can more intentionally live up to our values of social justice. This is why it gives me such great pleasure to introduce today a fellow education scholar who is leading the national conversation on social justice for Black girls in schools, Dr. Monique W. Morris. Dr. Morris's prolific scholarship has been dedicated to improving juvenile justice, educational opportunities, and full participation for Black girls and women and their families. Her documentary, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, draws from her book of the same name, as well as from her newest work, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for the Liberation of Black and Brown Girls. Push Out highlights how disciplinary practices and bias lead to school to prison pipeline for Black girls. This is a call to action for educators and policymakers everywhere. Her work has been championed by equity-minded policy advocates, ranging from Congressional Representative Ayanna S. Pressley to Gloria Steinem. In the follow-up book to Push Out, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Dr. Morris invokes the spirit of the blues in envisioning and empowering pedagogy for Black and brown girls. Her work reimagines what education might look like if schools place the well-being of Black and brown girls at their center. She merges rigorous scholarship with on-the-ground knowledge of teachers to put forward a manifesto that rejects punishment, trauma, and discrimination, and instead advocates for safety, justice, and community in our schools. Dr. Morris is also the first executive director of Grant Makers for Girls of Color, an organizing space for philanthropy to invest in projects that will help transform lives. And she is the founder and board chair of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, which works to interpret school to confinement pathways for girls. I'm sorry to interrupt, school to confinement pathways for girls. We are honored to have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Morris's 30 years as an educational scholar. And now, without further ado, please welcome author, filmmaker, and scholar, Dr. Monique W. Morris.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It is really a pleasure to be with you today. And I am thrilled to be in the collective space that is curated by both, the arts and sciences and education. I think they come together well, and I'm so honored to be your first collaboration. As has been mentioned, I lead a philanthropic organization called Grant Makers for Girls of Color, which we also affectionately call G4GC. It's a philanthropic organization that works to advance conditions for girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth who identify as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color so that they can achieve equity and realize bold and just futures in the United States and beyond. We organize within philanthropy to increase the capacity of organizations to support and resource girls of color. And we resource organizations led by women, girls, and femmes working to improve conditions for girls of color. It's a participatory engagement that we call reciprocity as praxis. I'm thrilled to be leading a stellar team of dedicated movement leaders who are engaged in this work with me. We have the Love is Healing COVID-19 Response Fund and the Black Girl Freedom Fund. In fact, Black Girl Freedom Week was celebrated by us last week for the very first time, which was designed to amplify the 1 Billion for Black Girls campaign and the Black Girl Freedom Fund. Before I forget, I wanted to share that information with you so that if you want to know more about the Black Girl Freedom Fund or the 1 Billion for Black Girls initiative, you can visit 1billionforblackgirls.org. And if you identify as a Black woman, femme, or girl, please complete the survey asking for your input on investment priorities for the fund. To tell you a little bit about this fund, it was created in response to the growing effort within philanthropy to invest in movements that focus on Black lives and liberation, which was great to see. But any student of history or one paying close enough attention could predict that the funding priorities would not explicitly name Black girls unless we firmly situated Black girls at the center. And we had the lived experience to know that would be true. We had the data. According to the Ms. Foundation's landmark study on philanthropy, women and girls of color account for just 0.5% of the $66.9 billion granted by foundations, totaling just $5.48 allocated per woman and girl of color in the United States. That's collective women and girls of color, okay? Not just Black girls. The data were really important. In fact, I want to spend some time today with you talking about data within your community of scholars, because it's been an important and driving force for the advocacy in this work since the very beginning. So I'll take it back a little bit. Early in the conversation about the school to prison pipeline, discipline data were being collected and analyzed by the US Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. It was only being collected and analyzed and presented by race and by sex. Therefore, the data were not disaggregated in a way that was useful to those of us who were recognizing the emergence of trends in the public domain that suggested a need to examine what was happening with girls of color, and specifically what was happening with Black girls. We heard cases that included 6 and 7-year-old Black girls arrested for having tantrums in their classrooms, or Black girls getting suspended for wearing head wraps during Black History Month, or thrown around by school resource officers. But at the time, there wasn't a discussion of how these were not simply isolated incidents, but rather a pattern of violence against Black girls. Then the UCLA Center for Civil Rights mined the existing national data and discovered that Black girls were, not surprisingly, overrepresented among girls experiencing exclusionary discipline. They were the first to reveal that the racial disparities were greater among suspensions and expulsions among girls than they were among boys. But that was inconsistent with the dominant narrative at the time, which framed the school to prison pipeline as almost entirely a men and boys issue. All comparisons were being made between Black boys and Black girls, so Black girls were getting lost. It's actually an apples to oranges comparison, which I talk about in Push Out for quite a bit of time, because boys in general are more likely to experience exclusionary discipline than girls. The more appropriate method is to compare what is happening among boys and then to compare what is happening among girls. And when that happened, we were finally able to see that Black girls were the only group of girls who were overrepresented across the spectrum of discipline and at every educational level. The scholars at UCLA found that in some of the largest districts, the racial disparities were so great among girls that the ranking went Black boys, then Black girls, then other boys, then other girls. So we had work to do. After a significant amount of advocacy, the US Department of Education then began to report data disaggregated by race and ability for boys and girls, again documenting disparities that remain. The most recent data show that after 20 years, our nation's public schools remain locations, unfortunately, for increasingly punitive and racially divided acts of punishment, particularly for schools populated with Black bodies. Just last month, in the midst of a pandemic, cases were reported of Black girls being forcefully handled by law enforcement on campus. Those began to circulate, including a devastating one of a teenage girl in Florida who was lifted by an officer, slammed to the concrete, and then handcuffed while she lay unconscious on the ground. While an increasing number of schools are developing alternative practices designed to divert students from exclusionary discipline, we know that racial disparities persist among those who remain along the pathways to confinement. The most recent analysis of national data on school discipline conducted by Georgetown's Center on Poverty and Inequality found that Black girls are approximately 4 times more likely than white girls to face suspension and expulsion, and are 5.3 times more likely to be transferred to an alternative school for disciplinary reasons. It's also worth noting that across the spectrum of discipline, Black girls continue to experience a greater racial disparity than their male counterparts. For example, Black boys are just over 2.5 times more likely than white boys to experience suspension, while Black girls are 4 times more likely than white girls to experience suspension. Black boys are just under 2.5 times more likely than white boys to be arrested on campus, while Black girls are 3.6 times more likely than white girls to experience the same. Data is everywhere in this work. But I want to talk about how we can engage a more expansive understanding of how research and what research will help us support the development of futures that we call at G4GC just and liberated. There are other ways of knowing that also inform what we know and how we know what we know. John Herron referred to this as extended epistemology in the body of literature on participatory action research methods. For Herron, the elements of this extended epistemology include experiential knowledge, so what we experience, presentational knowledge, or the stories and images, symbolism that teach and reflect understanding of concepts, presentational knowledge, or the stories, I'm sorry, I talked about that. The presentational knowledge of the stories and images, symbolism that teach and reflect understanding of core concepts, but also the propositional knowledge or the theoretical concepts and numerical data that we privilege in our society and academic institutions, and practical knowledge that we learn through application. And I add intuition and memory as extensions of knowing that show up in ritual and sometimes in our subconscious and bodies. I wrote Push Out at a time, after I had already written a street novel, Too Beautiful for Words, after I had worked with Kemba Smith on her biography exploring the impact of mandatory minimum sentencing, and after I wrote Black Stats, African Americans by the Numbers in the 21st Century. Each of these projects complemented the empirical research that I was leading at various academic, nonprofit, and civil rights institutions, and each of these projects was meant to engage a different way of knowing. The Push Out documentary, which was based, as was mentioned, was based on 2 of my books, Push Out and Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, expanded this exploration into film, and in doing so, serves as an invitation for others to join the inquiry. The film was intended to make this conversation about Push Out even more accessible, especially to those who don't enjoy reading or who cannot read the books the way that I wrote them. I was clear and remain clear that there are multiple ways to tell a story, to explore and confirm understanding, and there are multiple ways to call scholars and advocates into this work such that they are working together and not in silos. I understood from a few decades by the time I'd written Push Out that there was a deep importance to engaging multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of engaging inquiry, such that we complete the narratives that call us to action. I like to say that I don't produce research or engage in projects that are meant to sit on a shelf. Rather, I privilege the work that is going to engage in some actionable change. It is, for me, validity is also about the degree to which a certain knowledge is not only confirmed by multiple ways of knowing, but also when dealing with human participants, the extent to which it is informed by the perspectives of those at the center of the inquiry. I firmly believe in participatory processes, particularly in research, because they help us better align with what our ancient practices have already told us. Knowledge and expertise are distributed. Also, people know when they've been erased from a narrative. I remember my own mother talking about getting calls from different surveys or listening to reports of surveys. And the first thing out of her mouth, if someone said, a certain number of households felt a certain way, her instant way of responding to that was, no one called me. So she also knew that there was an erasure and an absence of narrative. I was taught very early on that unless we involved those who could represent multiple sort of aspects of this work, that we would not be getting the full picture. And this was really an essential element for the construction of the book Push Out, because it was developed from participatory action research and anchored in the voices of those who are living this experience. And in my work, it has not negatively impacted any so-called objectivity. To the contrary, it has enhanced the trust between the story and the storytellers, such that we have a more accurate and complete rendering of the issue. There's an African saying that until the lions have their own historian, the story of the hunt will glorify the hunter. In my work, I try to explore how the lions are impacted, but also the fly on the lion's tail. The antelope, the grass, we're all impacted by the story of the hunt, whether we acknowledge that or even if we're not acknowledging that. And so in my work, I have attempted to fully engage practices that help us decolonize our research methods and understand that when inquiry involves people, they are not subjects, but rather participants. I share this with you today because I'm essentially arguing that, and I guess I have been arguing this for a while now, that this work with Black girls, and in this work that we're doing with Black girls, we must bring our full selves to the inquiry, especially if we are Black women centering Black girlhood and womanhood in our scholarship. That's why in the film, those who have seen it will notice that the girls speak directly into the camera. For those who might have recognized that, they may also have noticed that the adults in the film speak slightly off-center or are captured slightly off-center. And that was intentional. And it's because we wanted girls to directly engage the viewer, to call upon an element in the viewing of the film that would invite the viewer to be much more engaged and not a passive person experiencing this film, but to actually feel as if they're in conversation with her. And the hope was that the viewer might feel not just more connected to the story if the girls look directly at you as they're sharing their truths, but to also pull a little more empathy out of us who seek to understand their conditions. Maybe we could bring a little more of our humanity to the table as well. So it invites a new rigor to bring your full self to this work. And for me, it's provided an opportunity to connect with, hear from, explore, and learn new competencies alongside Black girls. And that opens up new worlds. It opens up and challenges us to consider the context of an inquiry, not only as a theoretical exercise, but as an urgent demand of justice. I remember in doing research, and I talked about this earlier with a class that I visited. One of the students asked me if there was a particular incident that stood out for me in researching for Push Out, and one story that will stay with me. And of course, I responded that I remember each of those stories vividly, which is how they made it into the final product of the book. But one young woman in particular really stood out. And she was a 16-year-old who had faced some of the most significant traumas I think any young body could ever experience. She had been commercially sex trafficked. She was a foster child. She was constantly triggered in her foster homes. She shared an example of how her foster father even, once made a comment that he understood how she could be on the street because if he was a pimp, he would pimp her. Wildly inappropriate and dangerous conditions that this girl was living in, to the point where she tried to join a gang for safety, only to discover that they too wanted to exploit her and her body. And so she bounced around, got into fights, nobody responded. The school captured her as a girl who was constantly in fights and never showing up to class. And what they were missing were all of these life traumas that were informing why she was absent, why she was fighting, why she felt disconnected to her learning space. When she finally was talking to me about it, she shared that she had to, quote unquote, drop out of the 7th grade. And it was devastating for me to hear her say that, but even more devastating to know that she, at the time that I met her, had become a mother and was still in the throes of a criminal juvenile court system that was not really responding to her specific needs, that was not being responsive to her trauma, that was not seeking to get her connected to her educational goals. No one had asked her about her educational goals until I stepped into that room and was the first person to talk to her about what might be possible for her. And it just elevated for me how dire it is that our schools become locations for healing so that they can become locations for learning. It is also something that taught me about how we can engage a knowing about girls by bringing our full selves to the table. As I mentioned before, I had written Push Out, I wrote a street novel. And it was a street novel about a 17-year-old who is thrust into prostitution and is set in the Bay Area where I was talking to this girl. And so when she found out that I was the author of that book, the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, I can talk to you," right? She was willing to open herself to engage in a deeper understanding and conversation about a condition that was impacting her life. And she recognized, I think, in my willingness to bring my full self to her, that we could connect in a space that would invite her into a deeper understanding and opportunity for healing. That I wasn't there to study her. I was there to understand what was impacting her so that we could find a solution together. And that's a radically different approach to research. It's a radically different approach to understanding. And it invited a whole set of new ways of communicating that I don't know that I would have been able to fully pick up and translate for researchers had I not been primed by the brilliant work of Dr. Elaine Richardson on her work on African-American female literacies as a powerful example of how new worlds and challenges are opened when we bring our full selves to the inquiry, and if we engage our work not as a theoretical exercise, but as an urgent demand of justice. Dr. Richardson's work was really born out of the inquiries and readings of the unknown. As a scholar, she knew she knew an articulation of how Black girls uniquely engage language and literacy that was missing from a body of work on communication. And her work on Black girl literacies, what they look like, how they're performed, how they might be hidden to some of the sort of visual cues of folks not familiar with traditions and cultural practices among Black people, particularly African Americans. It all provided a foundation for me as I was developing a body of work around Black girls. And what I learned from this was that by bringing my full self to the inquiry, I was able to access information previously unavailable to those who did not know which roads to walk or how to navigate those roads. It's something that educators bring to their work often when they are entering a classroom and they seek to build connections or they seek to find a common point of interest. And all of that is really great, but it's important to do it not using or engaging a savior mentality, but rather an understanding that no adult is going to empower a child. No person can empower another person. What we can do is, and this is what I firmly believe, we can increase their capacity to be empowered. Our function is not to save Black girls, but rather to help them pull out the wisdom that already exists in their bones and remember who they are and structure our engagement with them in the development of tools that will help them be whole to live just and liberated lives. I remember having a conversation with a group of girls about that and recognizing it's hard work, right? And I actually said the words, "I want you to remember who you are." And one of the girls challenged me back and she said, "Well, what if we never knew? What if we never knew who we are? What then?" And it was an important moment for me as someone who engages in this work, who was working with girls at the time, who was talking about national policy and writing books and moving around doing professional development with educators and having these broad conversations to bring it home around a particular point of connection. If girls don't know who they are and they don't even know to ask the question, then that's when we lose their capacity to be empowered. We have to constantly be in a state of understanding around what is possible with our girls. We have to constantly understand that the pedagogical approaches that we use, the way we structure questioning, the way we approach answering those questions has to involve them in order for us to dig into a space of knowing that may not be apparent if all we're doing is mining extant databases and having focus groups that sort of piecemeal engage their input rather than a more rigorous participatory ongoing way to structure our conversations with those who particularly might be multiple systems involved and therefore most marginalized in the discussion about how we build out these schools that are locations for healing so that they can be locations for learning. The study of Black girlhood as a construct, as a lived experience, as an intersection with other identities requires us not to work in silos. It requires us to engage our scholarship and our practices as if they cannot be separated from the work of the people. It's one of the reasons that I, in my TED talk about education as freedom work. One reason I do that is because, from the data that we have been able to collect and the way that we understand education functioning in the life of a girl, we recognize that girls with an education are significantly less likely to be in contact with the juvenile court system, less likely to be engaged in relationships that are abusive with them, are less likely to have negative life outcomes and to live in poverty, et cetera. They have more control over their lives. And we recognize that young people who are in contact with the juvenile court and criminal legal system are also those young people who have not had access to education in a consistent manner and who have instead been criminalized for behaviors, activities, and mistakes that can place them at a deeper risk of contact with the criminal legal system as adults if they have even just one interaction as a youth with a detention center. So if our goal is to interrupt that, much of the work that I was leading at the National Black Women's Justice Institute and that the work is continuing under Dr. Sydney McKinney is really to explore how we interrupt those pathways so that our girls stay in school. If we want our girls to stay in school so that they have better life outcomes, then that becomes part of the freedom movement, and our focus on keeping them in school becomes freedom work. Education is a critical protective factor against contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. So we need to be finding all the ways to keep our young people in school rather than creating policies and writing out new ways and creative ways to keep them out of school. And it's also, part of my understanding about the function of education really being either an institution or the collection of institutions and systems that are designed to maintain a status quo of inequality or actively disrupt that. The work with Black girls is about actively disrupting the erasure, actively disrupting the opportunities for there to be an undermining of their value and skill sets, and a way to bring them into our community in a much more rigorous way to increase capacities of institutions to receive Black girls in their fullness without reprimand, and also to recognize when there is an opportunity for us to intervene as healers. The emergent data on neuroscience, I think, is something that all of us should become very aware of and begin to incorporate into our own practices in understanding childhood traumas, in understanding the presence and prevalence of childhood trauma in the United States, recognizing what our own triggers might be as adults from childhood traumas, and recognizing that young people who engage in negative student behaviors are young people who are typically operating with compounded trauma, sometimes transgenerational trauma. And our capacity to measure it is important, but more importantly, our capacity to embrace and respond to that is even more significant, because young people And everything that I have learned, everything that I have learned as an educator, everything that I have learned as a researcher, everything that I have learned in conversation, and everything I have learned as a mother tells me that our young people will say directly that they don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? They want to know that they have the relationships in place so that they can trust you enough to learn from you. When I've had conversations with girls about whether they perform well or not, it's typically associated with whether they feel they have a connection with a teacher, whether it almost rarely will it be only about whether they connect to the subject matter. And that's what's important here in this work, and why it's critical that we begin to engage methodologies that expand our own capacity to capture their reactions to our questions. If we're asking questions about their engagement with school, or we see that they are not completing school or performing as well as we want them to perform, seeing that it's there is not enough. What we have to do is continue the inquiry so that we understand why these disparities are existing, why they are feeling this disconnection. And often what I have found in my exploration of those questions is that it boils down to them not feeling that they're valued in the classroom. One of my favorite contemporary artists is Kerry James Marshall, and he has beautiful paintings of rich Black bodies that occupy the space on the canvas. And in so many ways, this was meant to disrupt the narrative in the art world about the presence of Black bodies, and rendering them as beautiful rather than problematic. We have to do the same thing in education. We have to do the same thing in our classrooms, in our policies, in our practices, in our everyday interactions with our young people, particularly our Black girls. We have to not see their presence as problematic. We have to see them as a rich contribution to the canvas and really build upon that work. The efforts to remove girls and to engage in the systematic harm of Black girls in schools is something that I have, mentioned before. I've seen it get better. There are schools that are engaging in new practices, but I have also seen it worsen in the sense that the racial disparities continue. And that is the core of what we're after, because education is an important life skill to have. It's an important value in our society. And it's also something that we can't divorce from the ongoing work of the Black Freedom Movement. My mentor was Dr. Manning Marable, and who I understand was a Terp, who is now an ancestor. And he used to tell me that we cannot do research about Black people without talking to Black people. And particularly in social science, research and the work of the community, the people, are intrinsically linked. That work between research and the people, intrinsically linked. And I believe he was right. When we engage our multiple ways of knowing, when we engage each other, we cultivate an understanding that does not exploit or render invisible that which can help us advance the Black Freedom Movement. So it's my approach to all that I do. It's an old methodology in the scholarship traditions of Black people, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color. And it has been an essential tool in generating scholarship that can inform practices that facilitate justice. So with that, I'll say thank you, and let's open it up for some conversation, which is the richest part of any discussion for me.
You have certainly, did I unmute myself? Yes. You've certainly given us a lot to talk about. Lots of wonderful gems. Education is freedom. I mean, just wonderful gems and ways of thinking about the work, and also thinking about how we do our work. So I really thank you for that contribution. And I'm gonna throw this to my partner, Dean Rice, and let her ask the first question. And then we'll encourage people who are in the audience to start putting their questions in the chat, and we'll move to that. So, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dean Thornton-Dill. So Dr. Morris, first of all, just wow. Thank you really so much for your careful and courageous work, and for your thoughtful and thought-provoking lecture. It really, resonates in so many ways with the work that we're trying to do in our College of Education. And at the center of that work is really very intentional efforts to prepare the next generation of educators to be more diverse and equity minded. So with that in mind, and that's easier said than done, to be very honest, particularly the diversity piece of it. But with that in mind, I'm curious about your perspectives on what it is that we can be doing as we prepare future educators to interrupt the patterns that you've described in your lecture.
Thank you for that question. I really think it's important to spend some time, particularly in the body of work that I've been engaged in, on this dismantling and deconstructing of our own biases and understandings of oppression. So much of how we pedagogically approach our interactions with young people and the transfer of information and knowledge to young people is embedded in what we believe those young people to be. When I talk about school to confinement pathways, what I'm often talking about, or the way that I capture it, is that I'm talking about the policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness that informs how we move, interact, engage with young people that may render them vulnerable to future contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system. So for Black girls, we know that a lot of that has to do with adultification of Black girls, or this understanding of them as being more adult-like. The groundbreaking study from Georgetown, gave us something to work with, and then the work of Dr. Jamelia Blake, further exploring how adultification impacts Black girls, really looking at the fact that, Black girls are seen from age 5 as needing less comfort, less protection, less nurturing than their white counterparts, are seen as knowing more about adult subject matter, or like sex, or to be more independent than their white counterparts. And all of this is not without consequence. These beliefs that Black girls are somehow more adult-like, will lead us as adults to treat them as if they should know differently than they actually do at that age. And so they're susceptible to harsher treatment. They are, rendered vulnerable to a host of other problematic engagements, especially if they are being adultified at a time when they are experiencing puberty. And their bodies are changing. And so the dress codes we have in place and the way that we enforce them, the way that we're reading Black girl bodies as somehow problematic, or we are problematizing the Black girl body in our learning spaces rather than thinking about them as spirits who want to and have shown up to school to learn. The emphasis really being on the control mechanisms in schools and the reading of bodies and behaviors, as opposed to really infusing this space as a place where they can feel comfortable enough to do that. So I think that part of how we begin to set the conditions for the next generation of educators to be able to hold that space as healers in the location of healing, so that learning can occur, is to be fully aware of their own location in this conversation about bias, their own processes for undoing the bias, with the assumption that you are not entering this space to cause harm, right? We have seen some videos that I think are absolutely exceptions of people who intentionally join professions to cause harm, right? And we have to acknowledge that some of those people do exist. But I believe more of us are in this work because we believe in the promise of all children. We love children. And somewhere along the way, we lose sight of that because we get bogged down with some of the other responsibilities, or we haven't done our own internal work to recognize that what we are doing is perpetuating harm rather than facilitating a healing that I think schools can be. Those schools and educators who take the time to unpack their own biases, who take the time to co-construct learning spaces with young people that invite them to be in conversation with them about what they need to feel safe that day, how they need to be engaged in community with each other, to establish that they can have a relationship with an adult on campus, and that relationship can already play a significant role in reducing the risk of that young person being subject to exclusionary discipline, are all things that educators need to know. Because if you walk in to the school knowing that your presence and relationship with a student can help that student succeed, even if that student isn't in your class, if you have another personal relationship with that child, then you're also playing a role in them feeling safe enough to learn. That's part of how we cultivate a climate of safety. It is not about You know, so many, I think, educators walk into the space, especially at the beginning of the year, having already constructed the rules of the classroom and already had have a rigid perception of how they're going to move in their transfer of knowledge, and have not done the work to try to build relationships with young people or thought about what those young people need to feel safe in the classroom in order to trust them to learn. I think there's more attention paid to that in the early educational years around relationship building, but then when we hit the you know, middle school to high school levels, we kind of lose that. And I get it, because middle school is hard. You know, as I used to teach it in that space for rising seventh graders and eighth graders. So I know that teaching middle school is hard, and middle schoolers will expose every vulnerability that you have and you do it gleefully. But it is also important, though, to recognize that when you do build a relationship with someone who is in these critical years of their own adolescent development, that that is something that can be transformative in their lives. I know the teachers that did that for me helped me keep focus. And when I made a mistake, they held me accountable, but they didn't criminalize me. And that's important. It's also important to know that when you have those relationships with people and you set up in a co-constructed manner what the climate of the classroom will be, that there's a lot more flexibility for you as an educator to also say, I need a moment to step back, or I need a moment to be human in this conversation also. And the students will recognize that in you, right? So many of my conversations with young people have been about how they feel adults want respect from them, but they have not at all honored the respect that these young people feel that they were born with. So many of us have a generational gap there where we might believe that respect is earned. For so many young people, it's not earned. It's a human right, right? And so that different orientation has to inform how we're building connections and relationships with young people. And it's especially important to young people who will be walking in trying to read energy. And I find that that is especially common among Black girls as part of the African American female literacies work that I was alluding to in my talk, that you know, a lot of Black girls will talk about they can feel it, or it's the energy in the room that they are responding to, not necessarily any particular individual. And so even if there is tension and, you know, someone is trying to intervene in that work, or you're trying to figure out how to engage it, you know, they might say, give me a specific example of who you're talking about and what you're talking about. And she'll check out and say, it's just how I feel in this space, because they can feel the energy of the room in a way that we don't acknowledge. And so I think becoming familiar with the extended epistemologies, understanding that when we're trying to communicate you know, information and transfer information, that sometimes we have to pause from the lesson plan, or we have to pause from our expectations of who young people are in order for us to actually grow together. And there has to be room among those who are leading schools to provide, you know, the kind of support for educators who may not come from ethnically and linguistically diverse communities, to be able to make those connections and to demonstrate love and not saviorism, because young people absolutely will know the difference between the two.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I think, you know, one of the things you've talked about is a real point of connection between education and the arts and humanities, where we really are learning about gaining self-knowledge, learning empathy as skills, reading and learning to understand other people's experiences. So I really appreciate what you're saying, and it in a broad context, and how it can help teachers and how it can help all of us in this way. So I was told to remind people, oh, I can see from the number of people who, I said the chat, it's put it in the Q&A. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A. So let me begin there. And here's the first question. It is all traumatic for these kids due to the pandemic. What can classroom teachers do when the system itself is not addressing mental health?
I so understand and appreciate, I think all of us understand and appreciate the challenges of this moment. And, you know, I think what we need to do And what schools can do is think about how to offer to students or build connections with local communities to provide the kind of mental health services that we know every young person is going to need. But in the meantime, when young people are exhibiting symptoms of having some hardship or experiencing hardship, it's important for educators not to respond with such harsh punishment that it leads young people who may have already been vulnerable to begin with to detach altogether. So we're still working through that, and I don't even pretend to have an answer that is adequate, I think, at this time, because so many of us are exploring it. One of the things that I did was, sort of operate within my realm of control. Another thing that I talk about in other discussions is how we want to use power, how we want to use our power. I elevate often Martin Luther King Jr.'s invitation for us to see power at its best, as love implementing the demands of justice, and justice being about power doing everything to correct what stands against love, right? And so, what I was able to do at Grantmakers for Girls of Color was lead an effort for us to invest in programming that's happening to support girls of color throughout the country who are experiencing some disruptions or who may need some individual advocacy in order, for them to feel like they are connected. Education, these structures are very local. And so it often depends on what infrastructure is in place in that domain, regardless of the national conversations that we're having. So not knowing where this question is coming from, in which specific community, it is important though to try to identify the nonprofit organizations and the other groups that are in the movement work in order to build out the kinds of relationships with them, so that if you do have a student who needs additional resources, you know that they exist. Oftentimes, this is part of what I was saying, where a lot of the scholarship, the movement work, and some of the, even direct practice work is happening in these silos, and they're not really talking to each other. And investments are being made in community response, or investments are being made in one body of this work, and they're not talking to each other. So I think becoming familiar with who the groups are in the community that are doing some of this work, and you could even ask your students if they know, or you could ask other groups. You can go to Grantmakers for Girls of Color's website and see who our grantees are and where they're located. We obviously are funding some organizations in the DMV. And so it is important to, sort of get familiar with the organizations that are responding to the crisis, so that when your institution may not be able to facilitate a more structured response, you can at least make a referral and build relationships with those organizations that are more often than not willing to step in immediately.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So the next question, how to liberate girls' anger from its cultural prohibition, and how young women are challenging sexist, racist, and ageist anger norms. This person says they're wondering if in your conversation with Black girls and young Black women, does anger come up? How important is it to dismantle stereotypes around Black girls' anger and make it more possible for them to feel and express anger without being criminalized, adultified, or otherwise punished? So
I really appreciate that question, because there's often that saying that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And I think I wrote in Push Out in the chapter titled "A Blues for Black Girls When the Attitude is Enough," that any one of us who are paying attention to the types of structural bias that Black girls are that Black girls are dealing with, it's enough to give all of us an attitude, right? And if you don't have an attitude, we have to question why you don't have an attitude, right? So I appreciate the question about anger, because that's also a natural emotion, right? It is an emotion, a reaction, and often a justified space. And sometimes also an indication that something else is happening. Because sometimes there's this lingering presence of anger, particularly among our fighters, that they can't even explain where it's coming from, why it manifests the way that it does. And so without the opportunity for them to do some of the other suggested interventions that I talk about in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, as a way for them to build, or schools to build, culturally responsive, gender responsive interventions for Black girls, that anger is left to fester. One of the emergent practices is the engagement of, sort of weekly discussion groups with girls where they have an opportunity to process their identities, process their concerns, process their lived experiences, and what that looks like on the school campus or off the school campus if they need it. But it's a safe space, and it's a safe affinity space for Black girls to be able to engage. And what the research found in that space, was that the more we engage girls in this cultivation of community with themselves, we anchor them in principles that are culturally responsive, the less likely they are to engage in aggressive, or what was captured as aggressive verbal engagement with other students, the less likely they were to use profanity or manifest anger and frustration in ways that are usually perceived as problematic from the school. I also really believe that anger is a valid emotion and that it's important for us to use the arts as a way to facilitate healing from that anger. And that so many of our educational institutions, or some of the practices that we're using, even in the transfer of other non-artistic discipline content, fails to tap into that as a mode of understanding or as a method of healing. So one of the programs that I helped to design coming out of this push out work, and that the National Black Women's Justice Institute will be releasing a discussion about, was a reentry program that happens in the Bay Area. That's a reentry program for girls who have experienced school push out. And these are girls, that were being referred to the school, or this program and partnership between a community-based nonprofit and the County Office of Education. These were girls being referred by the juvenile court. These were girls who had experienced, deep layers of trauma, girls who had instability everywhere in their lives in some cases. And these were the girls who were not performing well in any other alternative learning space. They weren't performing well. We were like, give us the ones that even the alternative schools say they can't work with. That's who we want, right? And we went and worked with those girls, and we were graduating them, some of them going off to four-year colleges. And we were doing that by emphasizing and prioritizing the relationship building and healing over the completion of assignments. And if they failed to complete an assignment on time, we still had the opportunity for them to come back and complete that assignment. We were not stuck to a rigid schedule. We were stuck to a commitment that their healing had to take priority in order for them to understand that they were worthy of trusting themselves even enough to learn. That meant that we had to engage other ways to deal with the anger. Obviously, a lot of those girls are angry for valid reason. And so we had stories of girls, threatening other girls, or we had situations where there might be conflict because somebody's friend jumped somebody else in the program, right? There were real scenarios that would have resulted in suspensions, expulsions, et cetera, that we took that off the table. We were like, these girls have been suspended enough, right? These girls have been expelled enough. That's not what we're after. What we're after is a connection to try to figure out how to move them forward. We hired a drama therapist, had them engaged in physical activities. We hired someone who could teach our girls boxing. And for some that was counterintuitive, because they were like, why are you teaching fighters how to box? But the reality was that girls were interested in learning the discipline of boxing. And for many of these girls, the instructor, who was a man, was the first positive interaction that they'd had with a male authority figure. And he was teaching them how to protect their bodies rather than exploit their bodies. And so that was a very different way of engaging, but it taught us a lot about the need for there to be poetic engagement, artistic engagement, movement of body as a way to release the anger, to heal from whatever is ultimately troubling them, and to move into a space of community building. It's possible.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Next question. Asking you to talk a little more explicitly about how we build trust across and within communities to do the kind of research you're describing.
Yeah, so part of what I think, so without knowing who is asking the question, I think there is an important way that we have to come to terms with, the idea that everybody may not be well suited to do the deep kind of work that I do with Black girls, right? And a lot of that is because there are certain points of connection that allow for there to be a deep space. Is partly why I was talking about bringing one's full self to inquiry. But that doesn't mean that you're not well equipped to engage in any aspect of this work, or that you can't go deep with a population that has been under theorized or engaged in ways that fail to tell the entire story. The deep work that happens that I've been able to do really is a function of a trust built on how I talk to them, so the language I use, a trust of from an understanding that we share about conditions in community, a trust built on the energy that I give not being judgmental or detached. Sometimes, I think for those of us who are especially entering into the research world, we're taught to engage methods. I said I was going to write a piece for Sage on this, but we'll see what happens in my free time, right? But there's a way that we're taught to engage in research that is detached for the sake of objectivity, and a rigidity to the instruments that we design. And I know there are ways to be more fluid or semi-structured, and some of those ways that we can engage the tools to be less rigid. But what I've found is a lot of folks who are new to research or who have not been in this for a long time will not respond to the girl as she's telling you what has been her experience, even if she's answering question number 7 when you ask question number 2. So a lot of times folks will stick to the protocol and say, I must stick to the protocol, or I'm gonna, somehow jeopardize the validity of what it is that I'm collecting. And my argument is that when you are actively listening and familiar with, and in my work, Black girl literacies, that if she answered question number 7 when she was responding to question number 2, and you asked question number 7, she's instantly checked out because you weren't listening. And so it's important to think about how to build a connection, to say, I want to listen to you, to develop those deep listening skills, to recognize those as skills, and to be part of a community to assist with interpreting, especially if you're just getting started with interpreting what people are meaning, and to ask questions when you're not sure, and to ask them in a way that doesn't feel like you're probing and they are a subject. One of the things that I hate about IRB processes, and that I wish would change immediately, is the way that we characterize human beings who are part of our study and inquiry. That is, I think I've mentioned in passing, tonight, that it's important for us not to see them as subjects, but to see them as participants, because it acknowledges that there is a wisdom that we are not seeking to extract from them to benefit us and our paper that we're writing or our study that we are going to be the first to publish, but to really think about an exchange of information and a relationship that can be mutually beneficial, that is not only about a single, sort of element of this conversation winning. If in the deep work that I do, I'm clear about that from the very beginning. It's a part of my instruments, it's a part of my protocol. And so from the initial conversation, people know who I am, where I'm coming from, what this is about, how it will be used, and if they have questions about any of it, I'm available to answer it before I move on. And a lot of times we have those protocols in place, but in the transfer of that information to, especially with young people, they want to know that you care. Even the girl that I was talking about earlier, who had faced all of these life traumas, in the course, I think one of the days that I came back to talk to her, she said, you should teach a class here. And I asked her, I said, why should I teach a class here? And she said, because I feel like you care. That was her only criteria, right? She was like, I feel like you care. So because you care, I'd come to your class, right? And so, it's important for folks to understand that how we relate to each other is also how we build the trust. I don't assume I have their trust when I walk in the door. In fact, I assume, like many of the girls that I interacted with, that they actually want to fight me. And I have to say, that's not what we're doing today, right? Like, that is not the energy at all. And then after they challenge me a few times and realize I'm not the one, they're like, okay, that's not the energy for today. So I'll tell you what I'm really feeling. And it's working past that and recognizing that, I think once the girls recognize in me and trust in me that I do not, under any circumstances, feel that they are disposable, then they're willing to move forward.
When you started out, did you have that level of confidence about being able to make that connection?
In some ways, yes. And in some ways, no. So, as a young scholar, I think because I started teaching so young, I already knew how to build relationships. I was part of a breakthrough collaborative program, a beautiful model in San Francisco. I was a student in this program and then became a teacher in this program, and then brought this program, helped to be part of a team that brought this program to New Orleans. It's shifted over time, the Breakthrough Collaborative, but at the time it was called Summer Bridge, and it was high school and college students who wanted to become teachers or aspiring educators would teach middle school students. And so the idea was that we were just fresh from learning this material, and if we had the confidence and we had the command of the subject matter, that we could lead and design whole lesson plans and really engage in cultivating learning among this body of students. And the students were kids who were at low performing schools, but they were high performing kids. So like me, who was at a school that was, marginally performing, I was a high performing student and bored out of my mind, right? Spent most of my time out in the hallways, drawing, doing something that was not related to the work because the work for me was too easy. And so they, plucked kids like me out of the schools and then put us all in a program and said, okay, now you will be challenged. And for many of us, it was like, whoa, okay, I am challenged for the first time. But, what it did was produce people who were educators later in life, or, leaders of industry in other ways, because they recognized what they could do. And there was a deep investment in what they could do. And so because I had gone through that experience, I think when I was first starting out as a researcher, I knew, given that I was researching work with young people, I knew how to make those connections because I had already been a teacher. And I knew how to make connections with young people, particularly those who might feel marginalized or who have come from conditions that reflect, historical oppressions, but also, a host of other life incidents that might have been disruptive to them. I knew there was a way of engaging with them that would take center stage for me. And it got me in trouble initially with some of the, faculty that wanted me to be less engaged, or, they were like, when are you gonna, and I might've crossed the line or two when I was first starting, because you have to learn the balance between holding the space and allowing for that young person to tell you their truths and leading them through the materials that you're designing. But I always had the confidence that the person I was talking to, or the people that I was talking to, were worthy of my inquiry and worthy of our understanding and engagement, and that they had answers in them on how to make the conditions better. I always knew that. And so even when I was doing focus groups and work in New Orleans carceral facilities with young people, and they would say, Monique, you can't go in there because those boys are in for murder. And I was like, they will not harm me. right? I was like, they won't harm me. And they were like, we can't guarantee your safety. And I was like, I'm gonna be safe, right? Because I knew I was gonna go in there and establish from the beginning, and I would from the very beginning say, I'm here for this reason. If you can't be in community with me this way, for whatever reason, it's okay. And you can leave at any time, or I'm gonna leave and I won't be able to share your information with others who need to hear from you. And they were clear about that because I was calling upon a different way of understanding in our cultural spaces, because obviously in those carceral facilities, most of them were Black men and young men and boys, and they held each other accountable. And they were like, if somebody started acting up, they were like, not today, stop, okay, let's continue. And that taught me a lot about setting a standard and a set of expectations that when you believe, Ivory Tolson has this beautiful quote that says, love Black people enough not to expect the worst of Black people, and love Black people enough not to believe every bad thing you hear about Black people, right? So for me, I would not believe, they're killers, they're murderers, blah, 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 all that stuff happening in the background. I was like, no, these are boys, and I'm gonna talk to them as if they are my brother, because I was young at the time, right? I was like, I'm gonna talk to them as if they are my cousin, and they are gonna connect with me because they're gonna recognize their cousin. Which is why it's important to have researchers in this space who can do that. It's important to have educators in this space who can do that. Diversifying the profession is a critical way to expand our capacity. And if you are not from the community and you're working with folks who are culturally and linguistically different than you, then it's important for you to say, I know who I am, and I know I have whatever to learn about you, and you can share what you want to share. Until then, you are not disposable, right? Fundamentally, this has to be about challenging the myth of disposability.
Thank you for that. So someone says, what advice do you have for pushback from the bureaucracy of K through 12 public education, policy and people who maintain barriers to help these girls? In other words, leaders will say, wait, we can't change because of this or that. How do we combat that?
Yeah, I think what's been effective in the places where that has occurred has been to have conversations at the district level about establishing equity policies that explicitly name and engage this conversation about gender in the racial analysis. And so that's helpful just as a structural piece. And then it's also really important to cultivate the community of advocates in your community. Again, there are folks in just about every community now who are organizing around this need to engage in some kind of elevation of well-being for Black girls in schools, or there are national organizations that can help to inform the development of a set of like maybe a small body that can begin the inquiry in that school. There's always, I talk about that a little bit in Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, is how we come to these set of excuses that might prevent us from moving forward, but that if we rely on the excuses and accept the excuses, then obviously nothing will get done. There are, unfortunately, what I've seen, fortunately, unfortunately, there are many educators who take it upon themselves, like educators often do, to use their own time to cultivate these conversations, to hold conversations after school, to move into community where they can say, I need to know who the players are so that we can work together one way or another. And all of that work, I think, makes them the better teachers. They're able to cultivate the safe space in the school in a way that sometimes without that engagement, they're not. But I do think there are a host of other activities that are taking place now and tools that have been developed to help with some of these activities. The United States of Women has partnered with me and Girls for Gender Equity and the Young Women's Initiatives to launch Principal Demands. So if you go to the United States of Women Principal Demands, or you search for that, you'll see a toolkit that was designed that includes an invitation for young people to write letters if they want to, or to look at template materials. But there's a lot of advocacy work that's been put into starting the conversation where people are being told they can't have it. We can have it wherever we want to have it and need to have it. We have to demand it. And so the tools that are designed to do that, can certainly be captured in principal demands, but there are also tools that have been developed by the National Women's Law Center, the Let Her Learn toolkit, which is available in English and Spanish, that also can be a great facilitator of conversations between either parents and school leaders or teachers and school leaders about specific data questions that need to be answered to be aligned with the law, right? And so there are some legal considerations that need to be made when we're talking about these issues that I think will capture the attention of most school leaders, because they definitely want to be in compliance with the law. And so there are a number of tools in addition to the educational materials that we've been developing as a community over time to help facilitate some of these conversations. And then I offer some questions at the back of Push Out to start conversations either in the home with the Black girl in your life about her experiences in schools, or other ways that as a part of the community of concerned adults, you might reach out to the Black girl in your life to see how you can be supportive of her.
Well, that's great. Thank you. These are tremendous resources. So now a question, social media has created a whole nother world. And so what do you think are the greatest challenges for the girls everybody pretty much uses social media. So what do you think are some of the greatest challenges around its use and what happens with it and where this goes, how it travels?
Yeah, I think as it relates to this issue of school push out, I really want us, I think I wrote an article about this for ebony.com years ago. I want us to break up with Black girl fights. They go viral and people spend a lot of time watching Black girls beat on each other. And they go viral in a way that I find just deeply disruptive to our ability to see each other in community and to challenge this notion. I think it feeds into the notion of Black girls as disposable. And so, and Black girl bodies as, somehow able to withstand a degree of force that other bodies can't take. And so, we see it with Black girls, we see it with Polynesian girls, and we see it with some Latina girls as well. And so I think it's really important to challenge and resist the urge to make those go viral. We need to talk about it, but the way they move among young people is just deeply harmful. I think that's a big issue that we have to try to figure out how to get ourselves around. And I don't think that it's about regulation. I think it's really about educating our young people about who they are and what they should be watching and who they want to be. I trust that young people have the capacity to make a lot of decisions that adults sometimes think they don't have the capacity to make, but they know when they're doing something, and they know how to, if we are engaging with them, how to interrupt it. But that's actually something that I would love to design a project with young people in a local community to try to figure out how they feel they could interrupt that cycle, because I think they would probably have some really innovative ways of thinking about how to shift the narrative. There's a lot of narrative work involved in this. And that's one of the ways that we shape narrative. I think one of the positive ways that we can use social media to shape narrative, of course, is to amplify all the beautiful work that's happening in our communities and to really begin to spread messages of resilience in a way that is not only tied to our understanding of that resilience if it is called Black girl magic, right? To recognize that resilience comes from investments, not necessarily from some magical power that Black girls have, but that we have to actually invest in them and engage in the support of their dreams in order for them to feel like they have the confidence to move in a way that is consistent with, how we've come to capture and characterize Black girl magic. I love Black girl magic all day, but I'm also like, let's figure out a way to make it such that the girl who feels least magical still has the capacity of her community behind her so that she can be whole and healthy.
So how do we advocate for Black girls if we are outside the educational system? Are there other ways we can get involved in the issues outside of schools and schooling?
Yes. There are young women's initiatives happening around the country that are really more intersectional with community and with other areas that impact the lives of Black girls. Again, even if you just want to start with the list that who are our grantee partners, Grant Makers for Girls of Color.org, we resource right now more than 100 organizations in 28 states and Washington, D.C. who are doing work with girls of color, particularly in response to COVID-19. These are phenomenal groups that are doing incredible work and often need volunteers, often need additional supports, often want help with amplifying their work and messages and campaigns. So, be in community with us. That is always an open invitation. There's always an open invitation is to be in community with us. And it doesn't necessarily mean, contacting me directly. It's our community that is really doing a lot of work on the ground in communities and able to, place, I think, and direct the interest of those who want to be in community in a much more impactful way.
Thank you. And then the last question, you've been very generous. On a personal note, did anyone in your family have background on this work? What were you, really the question is kind of, and you've said a little bit about it, led you into this kind of work and doing, and this mission really, what led you to it?
My grandmother had an 8th grade education, and my mother did not complete college until after I had completed my master's program. And so my mother was one who always encouraged us to read, especially me. She was very much like, read, learn, no, 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 no. Knonknow,
Oh, okay.
right? and it was also really important. I think I just kind of came to this work because I am a survivor of some conditions that illuminated for me very early that girls needed to cultivate power and be in community with each other in order to be safe. And that much of that work meant that we had to use what we had to really build community. And for me, what I had was a love of literature and school. School was, initially a place that was pretty difficult for me because I was educated in mostly white space initially. And I was othered a lot and didn't quite understand why I was even there. Except that my mother was like, education is a critical part of your development and you are going to do this and you're going to do it well. And so I think her unwavering commitment to education, even if she didn't have it herself or didn't see it among others in her family, was really important. But I'm first gen to go away to school and first gen in my mom's lineage to get a degree. And so a lot of this was trial and error for me, but also a lot of this was the investment of other adults in my school space, in my community space, to trust that I had the leadership capacity to take this on. And I grew up watching the Cicely Tyson discussion about Harriet Tubman and a presentation of Harriet Tubman. And there was always a part of me that felt connected to that narrative is because she had a scar in her forehead and I have a scar in my forehead. And, I saw little points of connection about her willingness to stand in the way if someone else was harmed, and her willingness to take her people to be free. And this notion of freedom was an ongoing discussion in my family. And so I think more than anything, I didn't know it necessarily would be education, but I knew it would be pointed toward freedom. I didn't know that it would manifest the way that it has. In fact, I went to college thinking I was going to be a lawyer and a judge, and ended up in social science and education, right? And so, but I knew that what I wanted to do was tackle this question of justice. And so, for me, early on with my writing, with my engagement around these issues, with what I was observing in my communities, I think all of that has shaped how I approach this work, why it's important to me, and ultimately why I fundamentally believe in our community's capacity to resist these multiple forms of oppression and be deeply engaged in a practice around liberation, because I know it's possible.
Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
really enlightening, and I think your emphasis on freedom and justice and really is very much what we're about, and it's clearly your North Star. And we really appreciate that. And I'll just say one little thing is that, I mentioned that my department is the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and we'll be celebrating Harriet Tubman Day on March 10th. This is the first year, and we have a grand niece. I can't remember how many grands, but we're really of Miss Tubman's, and so we're really excited about that.
I love it. I love it.
To carry on that legacy.
I love it.
Dean Rice, what would you like to say at this point?
Boy, what is there left to say? So I just want to say a big thank you. These virtual events, it's a little bit, we were talking before this about how so many more people can participate, but what's difficult is we don't get to see everyone's faces, and we don't know all of the folks who are represented here and behind those really excellent questions that were asked. But what I do know is that this virtual lecture is full of students and faculty and staff, that we have local educators and policymakers and alumni. And one phrase that kept coming up, Dr. Morris, in your comments was that, that we need to be in community around these issues. And one way to be in community is really to bring all of these different people together to engage in these kinds of conversations. And so I am just so grateful to you for leading us in this conversation, and just for your ongoing dedication to improving education and addressing these kinds of injustices that we have long faced in our nation. So particularly with respect to Black and brown girls in this case. So thank you for your wisdom, for your thoughts. We have lots to think about, lots to talk about, and lots of work to do. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And all the best to you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming.